What's up guys, it's GM Max here with a new haircut and a new video showing you how Magnus Carlsen wins his chess games. For our game here, we're going to see a game between Carlsen playing with the black pieces against Hikaru Nakamura in the New Chess Classic, but this time instead of e6, Carlsen played the move of c6 in this position, the Slav defense. And after knight f3, knight f6, Nakamura went for the slow Slav with e3. The idea of e3 is that if black were to play a semi-Slav with e6, white gets some extra options available, which involve delaying or even avoiding the development of the knight on c3, so a more flexible setup for white. But the trade-off is that now, without the pressure against the d5 pawn that you see with the knight on c3, this gives black the freedom to develop his bishop outside the pawn chain. He's not forced to lock it in with e6, but instead he can develop bishop to f5, or he can develop it to g4, as Carlsen did in the game, which continued with h3. And these days at high level, you normally see black try to keep the bishop with bishop h5. So if white does want to get the bishop pair, he has to at least weaken his king side with g4 in order to get the bishop pair advantage. But Carlsen decides to play to move bishop f3, which nowadays doesn't have as good a reputation because you are giving white the bishop pair quite directly. And it's thought that these positions are considered after bishop d3, knight bd7 and castles to be a little bit better for white because of this fact he has the bishop pair and the space. At the same time, we can say that black's position is certainly very solid, where these pawns on light squares do a quite good job of neutralizing the unopposed d3 bishop, so white's edge is going to be relatively small. And with that, we can sort of see step one of how Carlsen wins. That Carlsen doesn't necessarily try to force an advantage out opening with white. He doesn't even necessarily try to equalize by force out opening with black, but he tries to get an interesting position with some kind of imbalance, in this case the imbalance of the bishop pair against the knights, and that's often enough for Carlsen to outplay his opponents and get the win. Nakamura now played the move of rook to d1, just putting the rook opposite the queen and kind of keeping the options open, as it were. Now, if I was playing as white in this position, I probably would have gone for the direct e4 instead, just taking over the space in the center. However, black has a few ways to deal with that. For example, even if you were just to trade everything on e4, like captures, 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 and say queen h4, black is very solid, and we see that after rook d1, knight f6, and say bishop c2. Well, basically, black's going to put quite good pressure against the d4 pawn. You can even move the bishop at some point for that pressure. Another plan you also can see sometimes is black can also go e5 and try to hit back in the center. Granted, white should still be somewhat better in these lines, but I think that this position, even this worst case, is not all that bad for black, where he's got a bit of some positional disadvantages, but no real weaknesses, and the position is very hard for white to break down. So I plays rook d1 instead. Carlsen plays rook e8, which is also lending support to the e5 break. A lot of times these positions, if white doesn't release the tension, you're going to see Carlsen go for a very interesting middle game plan. I'm going to see if you guys can find it actually. But a game went queen e7 to queen e7. And after bishop d2, well, by delaying the move of e4, white sort of keeping his options open, like maybe he's going to play on the queen side, maybe he's going to take on d5 and change the structure that way. Now, let's see how experienced you are with playing these Slav middle games. What do you think is the correct plan for black in this position? While you're thinking about that, do make sure to like the video. It helps to boost that YouTube algorithm. And also comment below with the move that you would play as black in this case. Okay, well done if you realize that it's actually the right time to open the position, to open the center with d takes c4. And then after bishop takes c4, the idea is to go e5. And so you might be wondering, well, Max, why wouldn't you play the move e5 immediately? And that's actually a very reasonable move as well, but it does mean that after c takes d5, that you are going to be saddled with an isolated pawn if white were to play d takes e5. Now, it's not the end of the world. You do have queen e5, and you are going to force a little bit of a weakening like g3, and you do have your piece in a position to potentially go for a knight e4 or some d4 pushes to use that IQP to your advantage. That being said, dc4 just avoids that structural problem, where we get in e5 more or less without paying any kind of rent in terms of getting a weak pawn. Now, I think this is where Nakamura maybe start to go a little bit astray, because I think the move d5 does kind of give black what he wants. And the move I think that is more in keeping with the demands of the position is to go d5, using the support from the bishop and knight to push in the center. With e4, we see that black is also getting a good share of space, and definitely queen e5 is going to show up, that the white king is a little bit exposed. And after the exchange of pawns, what we see is that even though black has got these isolated pawns, he does have the space advantage. He's got very active piece play as well. So I think the position is actually easier to play for black, even though if we were just to count the positional advantages. It might seem like white's better, but, you know, I like black's dynamism in this position, because white's king is a bit weaker after all, once you get that queen e5 in. Well, the game saw d takes e5, black played queen e5, and now after g3, I think that the move b5 that Carlsen played is certainly reasonable. You know, black does have a pawn majority on the queen side, so it does make sense to advance that majority and grab space. But I think you could also make a very good argument for a more dynamic approach like h5. And the idea of this rook's pawn move, which you often see grandmasters play in different positions, is to go for h4 and try to weaken that white pawn structure. Because if white were to take, you'd have a move queen h2, and that would be a really nasty check to the white king. But on the other hand, if you play a move like h4 to stop it, well, you're also giving some squares. Like, for example, a knight might be able to come to g4, and it's going to be harder to kick it away. Also, a move like b5 is probably going to come in a better version than what we'll see in the game, now that white's kingside majority is not that flexible and not so easy for white to advance. I think h5 was a slight improvement over Carlsen's play, but his move b5 is also perfectly fine. Nakamura retrieved the bishop to b3, and a5 again. We see how moving the rook's pawns tends to be particularly effective when there's some kind of hook that we can go after. And that hook doesn't have to be limited to a pawn, but it can also be an opponent's piece, like a knight or a bishop or even a queen or a rook. So we see here that Nakamura is playing the move bishop c2, so that if black were to go a4, well, he can say, alright, I already moved the bishop away, so now I can play whatever move I choose to, like I'm not committed to whatever I played on the previous move. Well, Carlsen decides to play the move queen e6, which I think king e2 is kind of a move white wants to play anyway, just to defend the pawn. So I would have probably gone a4 and, you know, maybe even gone for a move like a3 and just tried to weaken that white structure a little bit and grab some squares. But okay, Carlsen's move is also not bad. Queen e6, king g2, and now a4 followed. And, well, but in this position, Nakamura played a3, which is certainly a logical enough move to try to keep that pawn in place. But it's also quite a committal decision where you are potentially giving black the possibility to put a knight on a c4 square, where it would almost be an outpost, because then it means if b3 you would be able to take when you're covering it with the pawn. And knight c4 would also allow you to attack that pawn on b2. So that's a disadvantage of a3, but to be fair, it does also fix the black structure. So I think it's a very reasonable choice. I mean, you could also have allowed black to get in a3 and just focus on pushing your kingside pawns. Obviously, that's also quite double-edged and would lead to a sharper position. So after a3, Carlsen did indeed play the move of knight to e5, which is sort of fitting in with the idea I mentioned of putting that knight into c4. There are other moves as well, like a move like g6 and just playing against the bishop. Well, again, we see a theme that I've mentioned quite a lot in videos in the past, which is Capablanca's principle of putting the pawns on the same color complex as the opponent's unopposed bishop. In this case, by putting pawns out light squares, we make the opponent's light square bishop ineffective. And we're also putting the pawns on the opposite color complex to our remaining bishop. So A, it gives our bishop on d6 a lot of mobility, and B, it also means that we're covering both the color complexes very well. Both the dark squares and the light squares are very well covered by our bishop and pawns. Well, Carlsen played knight to e5, and Nakamura played the move bishop b1 here, with the idea that he wants to meet knight c4, maybe bishop a2, and just try to be annoying with this sort of pin on the queen. I could also play bishop e1, that's another way to anticipate knight c4. But anyway, the game saw bishop b1, black played queen e7. Actually, I think that queen e7 might not have been the best move. Carlsen's idea is very prophylactic. He wants to go knight c4 without bishop a2 being a pin. But sometimes in chess, it's best actually not to play these sort of passive moves, but just to think, well, can I make my idea work anyway? It's kind of like in life, you know, there'll be people who tell you, oh, you can't do this and you can't do that. But what if you actually can? Like, how can we find a way to make it work? Often chess is the same, that it's often best to find a way to make our ideas work, rather than just giving up as soon as there seems to be some idea that stops it. You know, it's good to be able to overcome the resistance as well as to be flexible. So after knight c4, well, what if white did play bishop a2? I think that the threats, quote-unquote, of bishop c4 is actually not such a big threat after all. Let's say we move our knight to d7, maybe with ideas of supporting our knight or even jumping into b3. Well, if white takes that knight, I think that this is something black's very happy to see. Kind of like we saw in that Iranian Mamedyarov game in a previous video, beating the Spanish. Well, that b2 pawn is fixed as a weakness, and it's actually not that easy to win the c4 pawn, because the knight can defend with knight e5. The knight now has a very beautiful outpost with knight to d3. So consider the double pawns are actually a big strength for black, and that shows why in high-level chess it's important not to jump to conclusions and just assume that double pawns are always bad, because there are many cases where they actually are an advantage for us, like in this case. So that's the reason why I think this was better than Carlsen's queen e7. Another reason is also I think that knight e4 would give white a bit of an initiative, because you're giving a really beautiful long diagonal for the bishop. And you're also hitting the black bishop here, and if black does take, well, then that bishop is now on a very nice diagonal, where knight c4 is running into bishop c6. And with rook c1 and bishop c3 coming, that would mean that white has wrested control of the initiative with the bishop pair advantage. I mean, in the position before, you saw the bishops were kind of quite passive for white, but as pieces get traded, it tends to increase the value of the bishop pair in principle. So it's a good thing to keep in mind when you do have this advantage. Well, after queen e7, white played the move bishop to e1 instead. And now after rook a8, I kind of feel like after bishop a2, again, I like the idea of knight e4 and clearing this good square for the bishop. Now I feel like black is kind of doing all right here. I mean, there aren't that many pieces defending the white king, so even a move like h5 and just try and create some weaknesses is a very interesting idea in this position. Because often, even if they are able to take that pawn, they're usually not able to hang on to it. Sometimes you can even play h4 as a kind of sham pawn sacrifice. But Carlsen played knight ed7, which is also a very fine move, just kind of keeping the option to open up that diagonal for the bishop and stay flexible. Nakamura played queen c2, which I think is a very good move in this position, just getting off the out of the range of these rooks, and you never know when you might be able to discover an attack on the c6 pawn, maybe with knight e2 and knight d4. So it's the kind of move that sort of, it's may not be obvious to an average player, but if you think in terms of what are your opponent's weaknesses and how to attack them, that's how you can find these kind of moves. The game saw bishop e5. Again, I think that h5, h4 was the right way to create counterplay. The thing is, with white having the bishop pair, black's on a bit of a timer at the moment, where it's kind of like if you don't do something, if you don't create some sort of counterplay, white's just going to trade off some pieces and just have a very nice bishop pair advantage that, while it might not win the game by itself, it certainly will increase white's advantage and white's chances. So that's why I'm recommending playing a very dynamic setup. I think that Carlsen maybe played a little bit too simplistically. I think that's sort of like how Carlsen wins. Like, he doesn't really try to find the absolute best move every move, but he kind of looks for a move that just sort of is a bit annoying, that kind of makes it hard for the opponent to find a simple, good move. And a move that he kind of knows, well, it can't be that bad of a move. Like, one of the big advantages of Carlsen, in my view, is that he just blunders a lot less than the other top players. Though the other top players might make a lot of moves that are not, let's say, in the top 3 of the engine. Carlsen may not play the best move as often as maybe some of the other top players, but he much more frequently plays one of the 3 best moves in the position. Like, that's his special superpower. Anyway, the game continued rook ac1, but there was actually a really nice tactic that Nakamura could have gone for that actually the players didn't see. So if you want to challenge yourself, then pause the video and try to find this move, and do make sure to leave what your move would be for white in the comments. Also, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more of my Grandmaster Chess videos. It allows more people also to see the channel. So, in any case, the move that white could have played here is not rook ac1, which I'd say is the second best move that Nakamura played. But I like the move of knight takes b5. And the idea is that after the capture, there's bishop b4. And the queen would actually be completely trapped here if it wasn't for the move knight c5. But nonetheless, we see that after takes that white is winning a pawn by taking the knight. And, you know, I think that, actually, it's not 100% true. It is true that after queen b7, black is getting that pawn back with bishop b2. But I don't think it really works that well. I think after, say, king to g1, even f3 is also a candidate. But in a position like this, we kind of see that, well, the b5 pawn is sort of fixed as a backward pawn. White's got the bishop pair advantage and a bit of an initiative. So even though the computer will tell you that black can still hold, I think that practically it's much easier to play white. You know, the computer is giving the move g6, realizing that rook b2 would run into rook to d1, and there would be a nasty back rank mate on h1 if you take the poisoned bishop. But still, I can go queen e7 and, you know, trade off into this ending where, well, we can say white has the bishop pair in an endgame. The b5 pawn's a bit weak, so that does give white a very pleasant advantage with bishop b4, rook c2, and, you know, rook d1, and you are going to, well, have some nice activity. You know, even the trade of rooks doesn't completely solve black's problems on a practical level. So that's why I would have played it as white. And in the game, Nakamura played rook c1, which is not bad either. I mean, white is doing a good job of getting every single piece into the game. You know, you might notice that Carlsen has also done this, that all of the black pieces are also on good squares. This is something you're really going to notice top players going for consistently. Now, Carlsen played a move knight to c5, which actually turns out to be a mistake here. I think that the correct plan is to play a move like rook b8, and the idea of rook b8 is simply to prepare a move like c5 and grab more space without hanging the pawn on b5. I mean, I think white's still got some chance for an advantage, but black can play moves like g6, play the pawns on the light squares, maybe go h4 again for counterplay. That's at least how I would handle the position here as black. Actually, in this case, if you're going to play g6, maybe you won't necessarily go h5, because sometimes you'll have to watch out for queen g6 pins. But in general, that's kind of what you're going for strategically. well, after knight c5, the problem with this is that now this pawn is very weak, and I think this game is also quite good in seeing that, you know, you don't have to play the best move every move in order to win a game. Sometimes you can make some mistakes and still end up winning, and that's true at the highest level as well as at lower levels of play. So here, knight c5 is actually a mistake because of the move knight e2. And what we see here is that now, if the knight moves, then the c6 pawn is going to be lost. But it's kind of hard to defend this knight in a good way, because if you play bishop d6, for example, white can just take that bishop and remove the defender of the knight that way. But if you try to defend the knight, say, with knight fd7, for example, then there are moves like bishop b4, and it's just very hard to get out of this pin, and we see that, well, the knight is very badly placed on c5 with the crossfire of pins. So Carlsen played rook takes d1, and after rook takes d1 and queen a7, well, we see that Carlsen is incredibly strong in playing difficult positions. I would say that he might be the best chess player in the world, not just in general, but especially in positions where he has to defend a very bad position. Somehow he's still able to find very good moves, whereas most players, even among the world's top players in that situation, will kind of start to collapse and make mistakes and make it easier for the opponent to win. So that's a big part of how Carlsen wins, is actually not just being able to convert advantages, but being very, very tenacious and resilient in bad positions. So this is kind of a bit of a masterclass now to defend as well. Now, instead of the move rook c1 that Nakamura played, which kind of loses a lot of the momentum in my opinion, I think that the move knight d4 was the key here, because it's very hard to defend this pawn against the coming attack, because if black goes queen b6, even a move like knight f3 is really annoying, where white is just going to get rid of this bishop so that white's bishops are just going to completely outpace the knights. And once you get a bishop like a pin on d4, that's just going to be really, really bad news for black. Of course, black can make moves as well, but there's not really a great way to deal with these kind of ideas without making some sort of really big concession. So, knight at d4, I think this is probably actually just winning for white almost. Because if you play bishop d4, then again you have the same problem. White's bishops are just so much better than the black knights in such an open position. The c6 pawn is very weak, and I mean, if you play queen b6 to try to defend, like even a move like rook d6 and just keeping up those pins, like it certainly is going to give for black at some point here, where it's with bishop to b4 or some other transformation. Well, instead Nakamura played rook c1. It's true there are other good moves in knight d4, like knight d4 is not by no means the only good move for white here. But after rook c1, I think this is not so simple, because now black would have played knight d7, and you know, if queen c3, you have the move bishop d2, and if you're able to sort of trade off a lot of pawns, that makes it a lot easier to kind of hold the draw. So I think white's still a little bit better. Definitely the worst would be over for black in this case. But after knight e6, well, this is what Carlsen played in the game. And this is also where Nakamura, I think, made a quite big mistake. Kind of a bit of a surprising move to me, actually. But I guess that's what happens when we have a short time control, and when there's not much time to think. Another thing that Carlsen's very good at, he's also very good at basically finding good moves quickly, where he has a very strong intuition that allows him to find good moves faster than almost any other player. Of course, Nakamura also has a very good intuition, as shown by the fact he is the highest rated player in the world in Blitz and in Bullet. Actually, I'm not too sure about Bullet. Maybe Fallujah overtook him recently, but certainly in Chess.com Blitz and FIDE rating Blitz as well, for that matter. In the game, White played the move f3, which I think is really a big turning point of this game. I think that instead, White should actually play... Again, there's more than one move at this point, but I like the move of knight to f4 in this position. And the idea of knight f4 is that you're actually quite happy to get the doubled pawns, because if bishop f4 and gf4, again, you know, you get that very strong diagonal for the bishop. The king might look a little bit exposed, but black's piece are not really in a position to exploit it. And even that g-file can end up being very useful later for the attack, as well as, of course, the fact that the pawn on c6 is under very heavy pressure. And after something like rook c8 and let's say bishop c3, you're always going to put the queen on f5, and you kind of see these bishops just raking the board. And the knights are not really in a position to compete with them when they don't have any stable outposts to jump onto, as it were. So I think knight f4 is very close to winning for white, and even a move like bishop c3, trading black's best piece and preparing to hit that pawn is also going to be very annoying, I think. But after f3, well, now this e3 square is now weakened. I think that probably Nakamura thought he'd have time to go e4, bishop f2 and improve the bishop, but of course black gets to make moves as well. And well done if you found the move of knight to d5. I think it's the only good move in the position, but it is definitely good enough where we're going to hit that weakness. Like, often a good move in chess is just to figure out what was bad about the opponent's previous move and then exploit it. And I find that Carlsen is the best in the world at using this thinking technique. White should probably already play bishop d5, but then he's lost his bishop pair advantage. The e3 pawn is just as weak as the pawn on d5, and black would have basically equalized by this stage. The game saw queen c6, and after knight e3, I mean, the position I think is still equal, but after this very nice move, queen b8, defending both the rook and the pawn from the attack, I think that it's white who probably has to be a little bit more careful here. Because, I mean, bishop takes b2 is quite a serious threat, and I think that, in retrospect, white probably should have played the move bishop c3 in order to defend it. It's a hard move to play psychologically, because you're admitting that you're not really better anymore, but I think that it's more important to get rid of that bishop, and again, an important point is also if they do play bishop g3, is that you've got the move rook g1, and you're getting a very strong attack yourself down the g file, because black doesn't have the move bishop e5 to block it, because after bishop e5 you can't take the bishop without losing the rook to queen takes e8. So that's the reason why it would be a poison pawn if black were to take on g3, then it's white who gets the attack, not black. Well, the game saw bishop f2, and this is where Carlsen now went for a very nice transformation with bishop takes b2, realizing that even though on paper the bishops and two bishops are better than the rook and pawn, that in turn his pieces are very active, that after queen e5 it's not that easy for white to consolidate. You know, you're threatening, for example, to move the knight to some square and to try to win a piece along the e file with the rook and queen battery. So it's not so easy, and already white has to find some difficult moves. For example, move knight g1, giving up the pawn is not an easy move to play, but it's probably the best try. So that after queen g3, well, at least then you can play bishop e6, and then if f e6, you've got queen c6, and at least white's sort of able to get enough active play to compensate and kind of maintain the balance narrowly. Instead, though, Nakamura blundered with the move bishop c1, and unfortunately that move does just lose to some tactics, although actually it's true that, in fact, Carlsen didn't find the best move in the game here. So this is a good chance to pause the video to see if you can find the best move. This is a bit of a long video, but certainly also makes it a longer lesson where we can really go a lot deeper into the topic, which is also really nice. So in the game, Carlsen played the move rook to c8, and it turns out the key move, and again, I think the players were quite low on time, so this is why I don't really blame him too much for missing it. But it turns out that queen c8 is actually a winning move, because if you try to keep the queens on, like let's say you play queen takes b5, for example, then the move knight d4 is a very powerful tactic here, because if white were to take that knight, and if you don't take it, you're kind of just losing the knight on e2 to the fork. Then there's a move queen takes h3, and that's just going to be mate with king to g1. Queen takes g3 and king h1 and rook e1 is simply all over with the lawnmower style checkmate. And if white were to play queen c8 and try to bail out into an endgame, black's going to play rook takes c8, and after bishop takes e6. The reason for bishop e6 is that if you don't play this, you're running into a rook c2 fork, and that's going to pick up a piece. But after bishop e6, black can actually play the move rook c2 anyway, which actually is even better than the automatic f takes e6 here, where it turns out it's a position where the bishops just aren't really able to coordinate. The fact that white king is cut off really makes life difficult, and the way that black's going to win is either by playing rook e1 and winning the bishop with a fork, or if bishop to f4, black has a very nice breakthrough. So a good test of your endgame skill here, and well done if you realize that the key is to queen a passed pawn in the endgame. So we play b4, using the breakthrough to ensure that we get that passed a pawn with a3, and white's going to have to give up a bishop in order to stop this pawn on a3 becoming a queen, say bishop e4, and then after something like, say, a2, bishop e5, well, black's going to get the winner piece, or win one of the bishops with rook e1, and I think that this ending is probably going to be a theoretical win, because even though white has the passed b pawn, black's going to just put his rook on b2, kind of neutralize the pawn, and then he's going to just bring his king to the center, and I think white will not be able to hold this world fortress. Okay, it's possible I might be wrong here, I don't know for certain, but that's my feeling that black should be winning this position with best play. Or if not, I guess there are other ways you can play, like, for example, you go rook b2, and take this pawn first, and only then queen the pawn would probably be good enough, if not the other line. Well, in any case, Carlsen did not see this move, which shows that even the world's best players make mistakes as well in their games. You know, in the pre-computer era, it used to be thought, oh, these players are just like gods and they never make a mistake. But the engines have shown that, well, we are human after all. So, in any case, after rook c8, white played queen e4, and, well, the position would still be in the balance here, actually, if white were to play some moves such as, for example, even king to g2, and just defending that knight would be quite safe here. Okay, it is true in this case, black does have a tactic of rook c1, and then queen d2 does allow him to get the piece back. But after queen e2, queen takes c1, well, white goes bishop e6, and it just ends up being a draw here, where white's going to have a perpetual check with king f8, queen d6, and so on. This is not a good way out of the checks for the black king. And if white does grab the pawn, then black's going to give perpetual check himself against the white king, or simply take the pawn on a3 with pawn exchange, as it were. So okay, that would be the sort of logical outcome of the game. There would normally be a draw. But one of Carlsen's great abilities is his ability to just kind of keep the game going, not give your opponent any easy way just to kill the game and just say, okay, I'm just going to make good move after good move, and if you can't keep up, then I'm going to win the game. And it's amazing how many games he's won from these positions where the engine says it's 0-0-0, and then he just somehow, the opponent just makes an unforced error and just wins. And Carlsen just wins. So the game went bishop e3, and that was where things started to go a bit wrong for white, where black played queen d1. Maybe queen rook g8 was better, but anyway, where it was knight g1, queen c2, and, well, this was the point where white had his last chance to basically stay in the game. If he had played the move bishop takes e6 and sort of forced the trade of queens, it might look like a difficult position because of the fact that the a3 pawn is quite weak. But by playing bishop d2 and anchoring that bishop on the b4 square, white would actually still be very much in the game. For example, after rook c4, white will play knight f3. And although black has one passed pawn, white's doing a pretty good job of covering it with the knight and the king. And white can at some point put the bishop on b4, just blockading this. And of course, black is still better here. It's definitely not, white's not completely out of the woods. But I think that with careful play, white should be able to draw as long as he doesn't make some sort of silly mistake or, botch the fortress, as it were. You might know Carl saying that I don't believe in fortresses, but I do believe in this particular fortress for white. But instead, after queen d5, this was just a decisive mistake, where after the move rook d8, white resigned here because he doesn't have a good move to keep the defense of the bishop. If you play queen takes b5, black is simply going to take the bishop, and, well, Magnus Carlsen knows how to win with an extra exchange, especially when you add to this that the white king is way more exposed than the black king, which is really a decisive factor as well at this point. So there you have it. You've seen how Magnus Carlsen wins. And you've seen he doesn't necessarily play in order to get an advantage with white or equality out of black. But he's aimed to get a position with this sort of imbalance where he can kind of keep the game going for a long time. Sort of make it so he can be annoying and not make his opponent's decisions easy. And then just by playing a lot of reasonable moves, not say try and play the best move. By doing that, he just sort of uses the length of the game to his advantage, saying that, okay, I'm going to play 40 good moves, and if you don't keep up with me, I'm going to win. If you do, okay, a draw is still a logical result of a well-played chess game. That's kind of his philosophy. But one thing he likes to say, which kind of I think part of this game as well, is that if he has a 2% chance of winning, a 98% chance of drawing, he's going to play that 2 extra hours in order to milk the most of that 2% chance and get those extra half points and points on the board. So that being said, well, I'm glad that you guys enjoyed this video. Do leave a like because it helps boost the algorithm. Comment below of what you learned. And finally, do make sure to hit that subscribe button so that you can be up to date with more videos like this one. That all helps support the channel. It all helps me to make more videos like this one. So know that you guys are enjoying it. And I'll make more stuff like this. So anyway, congrats on completing the video. And I'll see you guys in the next one.